Have you been wondering how to build a successful strategy with open source for your company? Or why would you invest in open source projects when you can use the code for free? Are you an open source maintainer on the edge of burnout? Or a newcomer who's too intimidated to take the first steps and get involved? Maybe you're not a code developer and you think that there's no place for you in the open source ecosystem. You're not alone. My name is Ildiko, and this is the My Open Source Experience podcast, where my guests and I share our open source journeys with all the successes, the struggles, and joyful moments. Find the answers to your questions and dilemmas, and more importantly, join us and be part of the community. Hello, everyone, and welcome back on the My Open Source Experience podcast. It is a new year, and it is a semi-new podcast that I'm bringing you. If you're watching the episode, then you will see that my backdrop is different, but that is not the only thing that is different about the podcast. I am now your solo host because my co-host, Phil Robb, has recently retired from the podcast. It doesn't mean that you will not see him anymore. There are still episodes and segments that will have Phil on as well. I am very excited to give you a little bit of sneak peek into the remainder of season 3 because we will talk about topics like inclusion in open source, as well as women in tech and women in open source communities. We will talk about internships and mentorship programs. And I have not one, but two people later in this season who talk about creating and maintaining an open source project for over 3 decades. And one of those projects is actually celebrating its 30th anniversary this year. Can you guess which one that is? Comment below or share your guesses on social media. For this episode, I have some segments to share with you in various topics. But before I do that, let me give you a little bit of a rundown on upcoming open source and open source focused in a broader scale events so that you don't miss coming together with the open source ecosystem and mingle with people, whether you are already an established person in open source or a newcomer who needs to learn and also make some new open source friends. Many of these events are all around the globe. So if you're in Australia, then look out for everything open to the extent that it happens between January 21st and 23rd. So if you're in the area of Canberra, then go to the website, grab your ticket right now, or just show up at the door because the event is just about to start. A little bit later, but just like a week and a half later, in Europe, in Brussels, Belgium, we have FOSDEM on January 31st and February 1st. However, it's not just FOSDEM that happens in Brussels because FOSDEM grew into a whole open source week. So things like Open Source Policy Summit and ChaosCon and many other conferences and group gatherings are happening there during that week. So if you haven't booked your travel yet, this is the time to do so. Later in March, there is Scale in Pasadena, California, in the United States. It is between March 5th and 8th, and it is somewhat similar to FOSDEM in the sense that it's also a volunteer organized, quite big event about all things open source. Hopping back to Europe, there is FOSS Backstage on March 16, 17, and 18. The CFP is already closed, so you will be able to find the program online and register and attend the event. We are now going to South America because Nerdarla is in Santiago, Chile on April 16th to 18th. It is a large event and good news. Similar to some of the other events, Nerdarla has a full day of just online event. And even on the second and third days, which are in person, you should still be able to follow and access the content online. So go and check it out. A month later in May, between the 18th and 20th, there is Open Source Summit North America. And as the name suggests, it is in North America in Minneapolis, Minnesota. And this conference still have the call for papers open, and it is open until February 9th. So you don't have a lot of time, but you have a little bit. So if you have a topic that you want to talk about and share your expertise and experience with, or want to talk about something that is eye opening to others and want to share your findings and conundrums, go and submit your abstract into the CFP again until February 9th. And in France, in June, at the beginning of June, there is OW2Con. It is June 2nd and 3rd. And the CFP for that event is also open until February 14th. So it's Valentine's Day and CFP deadline. And that means that you have some homework to do for either or both. And that concludes the summary of upcoming events for the first half of the year. I will give some shout outs later in the season so you don't miss call for papers and can get your abstracts in and hopefully be able to talk at an upcoming conference. But even if you don't have an accepted talk, go and prioritize events that are in the area of your interest to attend if you can in person, but also don't miss online opportunities when they are available. These events are a great way to extend your social network and connect with like minded people and help each other achieve your goals. As Phil has retired from the podcast, I wanted to look back a little bit of a retrospective in terms of where this podcast started. So I brought you a little bit of a shorter version of the segment where Phil introduces himself, shares his first open source experience, and talks about why we started this podcast together. And many of the things are still more than applicable. For example, he talks about company benefits when a company not just uses open source software, but also engages in the open source project and community, and also talks about collaborative open source software development, which we both agree on is the sustainable way to develop and maintain software, especially software infrastructure projects. So, here are Phil's first moments on the My Open Source Experience podcast. So, Phil, who are you and why do you think we are here?
Phil Robb. I am currently the head of Ericsson Software Technology, which is a set of subsidiaries doing open source community engagement and open source work, in particular for the group of companies that are LM Ericsson. My past in open source started with Hewlett Packard in 2001. Starting a very fledgling Linux group that had spun off of the HP UX Unix group. And so we were a little entrepreneurial group trying to figure out if this Linux thing was going to be real in the world of enterprise servers back again in the early 2000s. And I was not really gravitating towards open source. I had heard about it. My previous part of my career, which started around 1983. So I'm old. But I've been doing operating systems internals and networking in particular, up and down the TCP/IP stack in Unix type systems, both Berkeley as well as AT&T System 5 from the mid 80s. And again, ultimately joined Hewlett Packard in their Linux group right when it was forming in 2001. And I've just found open source to be both very interesting and very counterintuitive to a lot of managers. I spend a good portion of my career explaining how and why open source works the way it does, and that open source best practices are actually good for a company to embrace as opposed to try to fight against, and the leverage that companies can get when they engage in open source projects. Through the last, again, 25 years, 23 years or so that I've seen open source grow, it's exploded a lot. There's been a lot of open source projects and communities form. And, open source doesn't really say much about what a community and community dynamics are, right? Open source talks about a license and specific freedoms you get with this source code around a license, but it doesn't talk about collaborative development and the best practices that have formed around collaborative development. And that's what I'm here to both talk about and hear from various folks within the community and different open source communities, and how those different open source communities work, and the companies that the people work for, how they work, and how they do that interaction. Like I said, I think a lot of things are not intuitive, and it's still relatively not well understood. And when a company or an individual starts working in an open source ecosystem that isn't working with best practices in some way or form, that's their expectation. And so they actually then propagate that onto the next project that they engage in. So just having an understanding of what best practices are, getting a cumulative understanding for what best practices are across a whole variety of people now who have participated for quite a while in open source. I think we can learn from each other. We can be good at articulating to those who don't understand and are kind of new. So I have the hopes that having these discussions with folks and with you, Ildiko, will kind of lead us to that.
Was HB your first open source experience?
It was. It was. Outside of, I remember I was looking through a Linux book in probably 1996 or so at a bookstore, and a guy passed by and said, "Oh, Linux. Do you do Linux?" And I looked at him and said, "I don't really understand why I would ever write code for free. So no, I'm not working on Linux. I'm still a Unix guy." Obviously, that opinion changed over time, but I do remember that as my first interaction with somebody about open source. And yeah, I've learned a lot and come a long way since then. That's for sure.
Do you have a grasp on when that started to change? That thought was like immediately ish when you were at HP getting involved in things, or did it take longer?
Yeah, I mean, as a fledgling group, we were doing everything. I mean, I was in the middle within the first 2 months of working. I was in the middle of doing negotiations with Red Hat to have them productize a version of Red Hat that would work on the Itanium processor, which was just under construction and just being released very shortly after I started. And that identifying how different Linux distributions worked, why they existed, and then learning the culture of the developers that were part of our team that were also well reputed and well placed in the Linux kernel ecosystem. Um, that was all fascinating to me, and so that is where I gained an appreciation for it. Like I said, it's mostly because it's so non-intuitive, and
Mhm.
those rules are, it's very much a meritocracy, and in the end when you step back and look at it, it's actually a much better way to develop software, which is why I would argue that Linux is, somewhere older than 30, I guess 32 at this point, and it doesn't have anywhere near the cruft and the non-used code that exists in any of the Unixes that I would describe, because the way they were built is different. And there are forces in open source ecosystems that make the code remain better and cleaner with less technical debt because everybody has to work with that code.
I would like to highlight one thing, which is surprisingly a little more applicable still today than I would care to admit, which is when Phil mentioned that one of his first impressions a little while ago was, why would I write software for free? And he changed his mind since then. And the thing is that I still see and meet people who are in this stage of learning about free and open source software. And it's never too late to take next steps on that journey. So I'm hoping that this previous segment was an inspiration for people who are still wondering why they should do more than just use the free and open source software projects that they depend on either for their business or in their personal lives. On the note of talking about um, developing software for free in an open source community, I have a segment for you with Stormy Peters where she talks about the difference between the Mozilla Foundation and Mozilla Corporation because they both exist and they are not the same organizations, even though that they are related and affiliated, but some of the working structures are different. And she shares some of her thoughts and experiences that she learned working for the Mozilla Corporation and how she was able to utilize those learnings a little bit later. I also wanted to touch maybe a little bit on the Mozilla Corporation, who you worked for, just because that sounds like a unique-ish concept, as Mozilla Corporation and Mozilla Foundation are not the same thing. And I don't know how many people are aware of that. And I'm curious if your open source experience within the Mozilla Corporation was any different just because how it was attached to the nonprofit foundation.
Yes. And I think Mozilla also for a nonprofit had a lot of funding, which was unique at that time. So the Mozilla Foundation is a 501c3 to support the open web. I don't think I can rattle the mission off verbatim, but it supports the open web and provides people an ability to navigate the internet with open tool sets. They wanted to create a browser. They created a browser, and it was making money, or they wanted it to be a product. And so they created a corporation that sits under the umbrella of the foundation. So it's a for-profit entity inside of a nonprofit entity. So the Mozilla Corporation is the one that's responsible for the Firefox web browser. They also created Firefox OS when I was there, which was great fun to work on. But we're a for-profit company. Now, all the money did not come through sales or support of our project. The money came from search revenue. So when you're using the Firefox web browser and you search for something, some part of that revenue, primarily, they've had a couple different partners, but at the time I was there, it was primarily Google, paid Mozilla a lot of money.
To be the default search engine on the browser.
Yes. I think there are alternatives, and you can switch it. Mm-hmm. But so Mozilla had a really strong volunteer community because it was a nonprofit, people that really believed in the mission. I mean, everybody at the corporation also believed in the mission, but it was a nonprofit that you could associate with, and you could be part of that mission, and it had a product that was well funded and well staffed. And I think that creates a really unique environment.
Was there anything in that environment that later on you could bring into the more corporate environments after you I think you worked at Red Hat, Microsoft, GitHub after the Mozilla Corporation. So in that experience, did you pick up any particular approach or way of working, or concepts that you could leverage later on?
Yeah, I think both GNOME and Mozilla, like two of my first open source software projects, had really strong communities of volunteers. Um, GNOME had a few more people who were paid by other companies to work on it, but they also had a huge volunteer staff, especially college level and a little past college, and then people who stayed on. Mozilla had a huge volunteer base. And so I think what I learned there is how to work with them and encourage them and what motivated them, that I think I've carried through all the projects that I've touched. But they really wanted to help the open web. They really wanted to get involved. They still do. I'm talking as if it's past tense just because I'm not there. But um, like when we launched the Firefox OS operating system to bring open web to mobile phones, we had huge communities of people around the world that were willing to write apps for it and work on it, and were very passionate about it. And so learning what brings them, what enables them to join, what keeps them there, was a skill set. And I think, like, one of the things, as an example, a lot of our volunteers came in as localizers. So we had MDN, the Mozilla Developer Network, which was a knowledge base of open web technologies, and they would come in and translate it to their language. Um, Even though it might have been more cost effective to hire teams of translators than it was to support our volunteers, because we supported them hopefully well, um, it was a door into getting them into the community and being advocates, maybe moving on to code, maybe not. So it was almost like supporting them brought the project more benefit later on. And I mean, Mozilla had big events that volunteers would come to. We had lots of regional events around the world that, we always had really great swag at. Whether it's stickers or T-shirts, there was always food. Um, it was very much a sense of community, and it was global. And the paid staff and volunteer staff interacted a lot. And again, I only speak past tense just because I can't speak I haven't stayed involved in that community myself.
And one thing that Stormy highlighted is that in Mozilla, she met a very large amount of volunteers in the community. And I really wanted to highlight this because I recently was looking at a community metrics dashboard, and there's one widget that shows contributors outside of working hours. And let's set it aside how the dashboard and the platform identifies what actually is working hours in the various areas of the globe, but it also sets a warning sign when the percentage of volunteers in a community, again identified by the dashboard, is above a certain percentage as a threshold. And I would like you to think about that for a second, because the widget currently kind of suggests that if you have, let's say, quote unquote, too many volunteers in your community, that might not be a good thing. But is that really not a good thing? Like an example, again, Mozilla and the community and the large number of volunteers who did have a personal interest in contributing to the community and in making sure that is developed and maintained to the standard and direction that is in line with their goals and plans and desires. And if you look around in the open source ecosystem, when you have people who are volunteers and not working on an open source project on behalf of a company, their motivation is actually really strong. And there are people who end up creating an open source project and then maintain them for decades. And again, we will have an episode on this later on this season. So when it comes to volunteers who are not sponsored by a company, they often tend to be more stable because when it comes to company strategy, then can change from one day to the other. Usually, the personal interest and motivation doesn't change that fast. And talking about community, we had Ria Farrell Schalnat on the podcast, and she talked about her law career and how she discovered open source and how she got very excited to not just be aware of open source, but be able to be part of the community and work more and more in the area of open source software. And I had a conversation with her about the legal community and the journey of the legal community working together in understanding open source licenses and the implications, how open source licenses are enforced through various cases throughout the history of open source. So Ria and Phil talk about an example called Grok Law in terms of how the legal community collaborated and shared information openly to their and their cases' benefit.
And I think that's a really important thing that you're identifying, because most people, when we think about open source communities, you think about the developers, but there are so many other communities that are around that, and the legal one is one of them, right? I mean, there are still great legal forums where folks get together, and that 2008 2007 timeframe was the period of Grok Law and the SCO license issues that were going on. Were you involved in that? Were you pulled into the daily happenings at Grok Law?
I was not familiar with Grok Law at that time. I became more familiar with Grok Law later on, and I was certainly aware of the SCO, but it wasn't something that I worked with directly.
Because that, for me, that was that showed me what incredible community there was in the legal community, because Grok Law had so many lawyers from all over the place who were quite passionate and normally very quiet. You don't see these folks until this happened, right? And this challenge, dubious legal challenge to the way open source worked at all was really in question. And such a rallying effect of the legal ecosystem. I was just, as a developer, I was shocked. I was interested in intellectual property. At that time, I'm working with Scott Peterson at HP, and Dave actually at Sun, and so forth. But yeah, the power of Grok Law was a tremendous community around legal interpretation and legal defense of open source as a concept. And you ran into the same kind of people who are just passionate about the topic, more than happy to share.
I think that's really the power behind open source, is how much people are willing to share. But it also brings up, you bringing up Grok Law, which is something I discovered later on. And it's an amazing treasure trove of information, even from a historical perspective, for someone going through that and learning about that area. There's so many resources available now for open source that are much more easily findable in today's internet than they were necessarily in the 2000s, or that they were to someone who was just starting to feel their way through open source, as opposed to someone who was really living it on a daily basis.
For someone who doesn't know what Grok Law is, can either of you just sum it up really briefly?
The Santa Cruz operation, otherwise known as SEO or SCO, they acquired the copyright to the System 5R4 Unix code, and then they made the claim that Linux was a copyrighted derivative work from that Unix code, and they started suing people. And they had they generated a tremendous amount of FUD into the entire open source ecosystem. Is this thing even valid? To a lot of companies, it really scared a lot of them, and a legal defense was made. So Grok Law was a website run by this anonymous person known as Pamela Jones, PJ. Sorry, it's been a while to draw that one up from memory. And it's never been known who this person is. She, he, whoever it is, was attempted to be doxxed multiple times. The fact that somebody was getting close after the SCO lawsuit had pretty well been won had them leave and just left the site dormant, and one day they just walked away. But every filing went through with a comb. There was an entire legal community that would take every piece of discovery and find everything from prior art or prior existence. There was just dozens and dozens of these people who were watching this website, seeing what the next thing was that was needed in the case, and then scurrying off to go find this information and then bring it back to this collective on this website. And SEO was just so frustrated because they were just constantly being thwarted with this group of unpaid people who were coming together to defend this open source thing. Because we recognized, if this case stood, it was a serious, it was Linux. It was a serious detriment to the open source ecosystem as a whole, and it was a serious threat. And so everybody just got together, and like I said, I watched this on a daily basis. I was on Grok every day watching what was getting posted, and the discovery and the resources that were coming to bear to protect this thing called Linux that I'm pretty sure almost none of the lawyers on that website actually used Linux, but they liked the idea, and they liked the idea of the defense, and they had other people in their company that were using it, right? And so it was just this groundswell of defense. It was really cool.
And while open source licenses have a much better understanding today than they had like a decade or 2 decades ago, there is still ways to go for people to better understand the licenses, the license implications, and clear out some of the myths and misunderstandings that they have. And there might be an episode about this topic later in the season as well. I talked a bit about volunteers in open source communities, and I have a segment with Wayne Starr for you today where he talks about how open source became not just part of his professional life, but also became part of his personal life. Because again, his personal interest in open source projects and not just using open source projects, but also making the conscious decision to participate in the communities of the projects that he started to rely on and was interested in. Wayne shares some tips and tricks in terms of how not to burn out when open source becomes not just part of, again, your professional, but also your personal life. Not go into your personal life, but go into it a little bit in the sense of like open source is something that you can do as part of your job. You can do it on your free time. And at least in my personal experience, that kind of blurs the line between your like day job and like outside of your day job. Like sometimes open source becomes a bit of a hobby, and then it's hard to draw that line, as people call it work-life balance, and it just becomes, I don't know, life becomes work or work becomes life, and it's just, yeah. So what is your experience in that regard?
I would say that's partially true. One of some of the ARM versions of Zarf were tested on my Nintendo Switch because I wanted to get Linux. I wanted to get Linux running on a Nintendo Switch. And then I actually learned a little bit about U-boot and some of those things, and contributed some stuff to the Linux for Switch folks, because there was basically a mismatch with running containers with the system D version was different from the Linux kernel version, so there's a kernel flag that had to be set. But being able to do that and play with this Nintendo Switch, and then be like, I wonder if my thing can run on this, is it's kind of a fun way of exploring that as well. So I definitely say there's definitely things that blur. I've run Zarf on Android just because that was fun. I don't know. It's interesting.
Did you ever feel that this could be a risk towards burnout, or you didn't go that far into I'm experimenting with these things on my free time and it just eats it all up?
I think there's the one philosophy I've tried to hold there is like, don't make your hobbies your job. And I think so. While I do have tech hobbies, and I do obviously like play with my Nintendo Switch and stuff, I try to have hobbies outside of that as well. Because if you make it your job, then you'll feel, if you make all of your hobbies your job, you'll feel like everything is work and everything is just this thing, and then that, at least for me, I feel like kind of leads to burnout. And so I try to do things outside of just working on software. I have a couple motorcycles that I work on. One of them is taken apart in my shop right now. I'm gonna have to do some valve work on it. And then I sew. I work on stuff around the house and build furniture and whatever else. And so those things help keep me, especially trying to do more physical stuff, because I still like engineering in general. So I like to build and play with machines still, but outside of the software space, that I think helps keep me at least in balance.
This segment is another great reminder as well how much motivation individuals have to maintain open source projects. And another example is not just maintaining projects, but for example, open source events. And there's an episode later in this season as well about being a maintainer of a large open source event as a volunteer who's not getting compensated for that work. Last but not least, I have a segment for you with Federico Gonzalez Waite, who used to work for the Mexican government and was part of the movement and process of the government starting to not just endorsing open source, but also adding open source to their policies to encourage government agencies as well as the corporate segment, education, and academia to rely more on open source software where it was possible and available. And Federico talks about the challenge of mindset change in a large organization. And when it comes to the government, it's even harder because in many cases, governments have a process to evaluate and purchase software and software licenses. So most people in government agencies are usually used to working with vendors and third parties. Now, when you get the directive that you should be relying on open source software and take control over your infrastructure and processes based on open source software, that means that there is no vendor company to call anymore. And Federico shares his experience within the Mexican government, how they went through the process of taking control over their software infrastructure and tools. So when it comes to people participating in communities, like language barrier is obviously one of the challenges. Was there anything else, if you have experience with that, like when again the policies came out and the government agency started to use open source, and then it just made sense to also invest and work upstream in some of the communities, like were there any other challenges for people to be able to start doing that?
I think the biggest challenge, apart from everything, was the mindset of the technical teams. Like you have to think that these people had been working for years by delegating all the responsibility to a third party. But when you actually change the context and say like, hey, now you need to learn, and now you're responsible for it, I think that was one of the big hurdles that we had, because it was just like a complete culture shock. And and we started discovering there was not only that people maybe were not interested in having the responsibility, but then there was also an issue of them not having the capacity to take on that responsibility. So of course, like, this is something that happened a lot more within each one of the agencies that I was in. Like, as a whole government, it was very difficult to get to those people, because it's like to get that scope on how it's going. But then we actually have to do a lot of work in like retraining people to be able to use these technologies, and changing that mindset of, I pick up the phone and I ask the service provider or the vendor to do the things, into the, okay, the phone rang, I am taking this call, I need to fix it. So that was a very big change of mindset of the agencies that I was in, and it was very hard to get them to change that culture. And so that, I think, is one of the big challenges. So whoever is doing an open project, this is one of the things that you need to be aware of, that you actually need to have those kind of things. Especially, I think the biggest challenge was when we were talking about open infrastructure, and and when you actually had engineers that were trained in Oracle, you had to make sure that they knew how now to use Postgres, and then you need to make sure that they could use some cloud technology, and then you had to make sure that they could also OpenStack and all these kind of different technologies. So it was a lot of retraining the people that wanted to be retrained, and I think that was something that was critical, because you could spend days, months, or years training somebody that doesn't want to learn, and that person is not going to work in this new ideology. So you better get rid of them and get somebody new. But getting those people that actually wanted to be trained, that was pivotal for a lot of the projects. And surprisingly enough, from our experience, a lot of the times the people that were like these senior staff members, they were the ones that didn't want to learn new tricks. And it was we did a lot of scholarship programs. So a lot of these scholarship people were the ones that actually would say like, hey, I have no idea what you're talking about, but if you teach me, I will be the one that takes care of that process. I will be the one that does that. So getting those people that wanted to learn was pivotal for everything. And that's something to keep in mind when you're doing the projects, because a lot of another thing that I saw constantly is that we would try to do open source projects with the same people that were doing the licensed projects, and the ideology didn't match, and that's why it was very hard to push them forward. But when they were actually like fine tuning in those teams, and maybe like a couple of people were changed and people with new ideas came in, that's when everything was a complete success.
Kind of resembles another conversation we had on the podcast, where I think it was with Wayne Starr. He works for Defense Unicorns, which is an agency that is contracted by the U.S. government. And he was saying something kind of similar, that if you run into an obstacle and you can't convince somebody else, then find a way around. And it sounds like that you're kind of saying the same thing, that there are people who are just set on something, and that is okay. But there is a way to reshuffle teams a little bit and make sure that you have those who have the open mindset of learning and moving forward and exploring a new area. So people needed to build knowledge and also be open-minded to build the infrastructure and tools and processes themselves. And there were people who adopted to this very well, and some others didn't really react well to this challenge of mindset and cultural change. And this is where academia, mentorships, internships coming to the picture. Because when it comes to hiring new people, if you look around the next generation of developers, engineers, leaders, then they are the people who are open and very eager to learn something new. And this is the content that I had for you today. And I am super excited for the upcoming episodes because we will cover a very broad ground. And we will start with inclusivity in open source. And my next guest on the podcast will be Shua Khan. And I hope that you are as excited, if not more, than I am for the next episode of the My Open Source Experience podcast. And with that, that's all, folks. That was our episode for today. What did resonate with you the most? What new ideas, strategy, or useful tips did you hear today? Or you have a comment or follow-up question to ask? Comment on the episode below or start a conversation on your favorite social media platform. Don't forget to like, subscribe, and share the podcast so others can discover it too. And stay tuned because the next episode is just around the corner.